The warehouse was packed with noise, laughter, the clinking of glasses, the low thrum of cheap music pulsing from a speaker in the corner. Cigarette smoke coiled in the air like restless ghosts, mixing with the metallic scent of oil and rust. Men lined the room, leaning against crates, hands stuffed into their pockets, faces glowing with the smug arrogance of people who believed they owned the streets. At the center of it all stood Victor, the man everyone called the King of Shadows, a gangster whose empire was built on fear, and in front of him, under the dim, flickering light, stood her, the officer in uniform, young, stern, back straight as steel. The insignia on her shoulder marked her as a captain of the Special Forces. Should have commanded silence, respect, even dread, but instead, the room erupted in laughter. Victor had given the signal with nothing more than a smirk. He circled her slowly, like a predator toying with prey, his heavy boots dragging against the concrete. His voice dripped with mockery, each word calculated to wound, to make the crowd laugh louder. "Look at this," he said, his hand gesturing to her uniform as if it were a costume. A little girl playing soldier. His eyes sparkled with cruel delight. He stepped closer, close enough that the glint of his gold watch caught the light as he leaned in. "Tell me, sweetheart, do they give out medals now for painting your nails straight? Or is this just dress-up day in the army?" The men howled with laughter, their voices echoing against the cold walls. Bottles slammed against tables. Some doubled over, clutching their sides. The sound was a storm, and every roar of laughter was another blade pressed into her silence. Victor wasn't done. He let the noise swell, then raised his hand, and the room fell quiet at once, trained by habit to obey. He lowered his head, close enough that she could smell the sharp burn of whiskey on his breath. His lips curled into that infamous smile, the smile of a man who had humiliated countless others and watched them break. "You don't pass for a soldier," he said softly, but with enough venom that the silence carried it to every corner of the room. He paused, savoring the tension, his eyes glinting like a predator waiting to strike. "You're nothing more than a doll in a uniform." The words landed like a gunshot. For a moment the silence was suffocating. Then the laughter returned, louder, sharper, more vicious. Some slapped their thighs. Others leaned on each other, shaking with glee. To them this was theater, and Victor was the master of ceremonies. But while they laughed, she didn't move. Not a twitch, not a blink. Her hands were steady by her side, her breathing calm. Her gaze never wavered, locked directly onto Victor's eyes, unflinching, unbroken. And that was the part none of them noticed. Yet, he mistook her silence for weakness. He thought the stillness was fear. His arrogance blinded him to the reality. This was the stillness of calculation, the poise of someone who had faced death before and survived. To him she was a doll. To her he was already a dead man walking. The humiliation was meant to strip her power, but in that silence, something else was being born. The laughter around her was fuel. Every insult was a nail in the coffin of the man who had dared to underestimate her. "Doll in a uniform," Victor repeated, louder this time, raising his arms theatrically. "Tell me, Captain, do they send dolls to war now? Or are you just here to polish my shoes?" He threw his head back and laughed, the sound booming like a drum beat. The crowd joined in, chanting "Doll, doll, doll," until the word lost its shape and became a cruel song. And still, she didn't react. Not to the chants, not to the jeers, not even to the finger Victor jabbed toward her chest. Her silence was a blade sharpening itself. Her stillness was the calm before the execution. What Victor failed to understand, and what the crowd would only realize too late, was that humiliation can be a weapon. And like every weapon, when placed in the wrong hands, it could backfire catastrophically, because the woman they mocked, the doll in a uniform, had been trained for moments exactly like this. Moments where ego blinded men to danger, where laughter drowned out instinct, where arrogance became the weakest link in the chain of survival. The hook was set. The audience inside that warehouse thought they were watching a play, a comedy at her expense. They didn't know they were witnessing the opening act of their own downfall. And she was waiting for the laughter to burn itself out, for the mockery to reach its peak, for Victor's arrogance to blind him completely. Only then would she move. Only then would the doll come alive and show them all what a soldier truly was. The laughter in the warehouse was still ringing in her ears, but her mind drifted elsewhere. His words, "a doll in a uniform," echoed like static, but instead of breaking her, they pulled her backward through time, into memories that told a very different story. She had not stumbled into that uniform. She had bled for it. At 19, while most of her peers were still deciding on universities or careers, she was already dragging her body through mud and barbed wire at the military academy. She was the smallest in her unit, the only woman in her class, and the one everyone bet would quit first. They called her dead weight, a tourist, a temporary distraction. But when the first winter training began, it was their bodies, not hers, that gave out. She remembered the icy dawns, frost biting at her skin while her lungs screamed for air. She remembered climbing the frozen cliff with raw fingers until the rocks tore her nails off, and she kept climbing. She remembered collapsing face first into snow during a 40-kilometer march, only to push herself up again because she refused to let gravity win. Out of 40 recruits, half gave up that season. She stayed. At 22, she was already deployed overseas. The mission was classified, buried under codes in black ink, but the memories remained carved into her bones. The ambush in the desert, the explosions that turned night into fire, the way the ground shook as if the earth itself was trying to swallow them alive. She carried a wounded sergeant on her back for 3 kilometers under fire, her uniform drenched in his blood, her shoulders screaming in pain. The sergeant survived. The enemy patrol didn't. She had seen things no one should see. Friends torn apart by IEDs, the smell of burning metal fused with human flesh, the silence after battle when the air was thick with ash. And yet through all of it she stood. Others broke, others begged for discharge, unable to face the nightmares when the missions ended. But she stayed. At 25, she became the youngest captain in the history of the Special Forces. Not because anyone handed her the title, but because she had earned it in every drop of sweat, every fractured bone, every scar that mapped her body like a secret language. She had faced evaluations designed to crush egos, simulations that ended careers, instructors who told her outright, "Women don't survive here." She did. Her body bore the proof. The thin scar along her ribs from shrapnel that had almost killed her in an urban assault. The old bullet wound that still ached when the rain fell. The tendon in her ankle that had snapped during a night raid and healed crooked because there had been no time for proper rest. And the sacrifices, those weighed heavier than the scars. She had lost birthdays, weddings, funerals. She remembered receiving a call about her father's death while she was stationed across the world. The voice on the line distorted and far away. She wasn't allowed to leave. She saluted the flag at dawn that day, eyes burning, then went back into the field without saying goodbye. Love had been another casualty. Every attempt at a relationship ended with long absences, lies about where she was, secrets she could never share. One fiancé broke off their engagement with a single bitter sentence, "You'll always choose the army over me." He was right. She chose the mission. She chose the uniform. She chose a life that demanded everything. And through those choices, she built a reputation. Her name was whispered with respect in barracks where women's names were rarely mentioned. Soldiers twice her size followed her orders without hesitation. Not because of her rank, but because they had seen her in the dirt, crawling beside them, carrying the weight no one else could. When the gangster sneered and called her a doll, she thought of the operation in the mountains where she had led 12 men into enemy territory. Cut off from command, supplies running out, radio dead, she had improvised, guided them through hostile ground and brought them all back alive. Dolls didn't do that. She thought of the interrogation room where she endured 72 hours without sleep, answering questions from superiors who doubted her decisions, defending the lives she had saved. Dolls didn't carry that burden. She thought of the medal pinned on her chest by the general who rarely smiled. He had leaned in and whispered, "You've done what most men never could." That medal, heavy on her dress uniform, had felt less like an honor and more like proof that every sacrifice had meant something. And yet none of these men in the warehouse knew. To them, she was just a woman standing in their world, an intruder in their game of dominance. They saw the uniform but not the blood that had earned it. They saw the insignia but not the nights of agony behind it. Her lips almost curled into a bitter smile. If only they knew that the person they mocked had survived training that had broken the strongest men. Missions that had ended in coffins for soldiers twice her size. Losses that would have crushed most hearts. If only they knew that their laughter was less threatening than the screams she had already endured in the chaos of war. She stood there in silence, letting the memory of her sacrifices steady her heartbeat. Each flashback was not a wound but armor. Each scar a reminder that humiliation was nothing compared to what she had already survived. And in that moment, while they laughed, she didn't see them as predators. She saw them as amateurs, street-made men who believed power came from fear, while she had learned that power came from discipline, from sacrifice, from the ability to endure what others could not. She wasn't just a soldier. She was the youngest captain of the Special Forces, the elite, the one who had already proven herself on battlefields far more dangerous than this smoky room full of men. And soon, they would realize the difference. The laughter had barely subsided when Victor, the gangster, decided to press deeper. His voice, smooth but laced with venom, carried effortlessly across the warehouse. Every man in the room seemed tuned to his frequency, as if his words were law, as if truth itself bent under the weight of his swagger. "Do you all know why she stands here with those stripes on her shoulder?" he asked, pointing at the insignia on her uniform. His tone wasn't curious. It was mocking, theatrical, designed to set the stage for another cruel act. A few men whistled, others chuckled, waiting for the punchline they knew was coming. Victor smiled, savoring the moment, feeding on their anticipation. He raised his hand as though he was about to reveal a dirty secret. "It's not because she's stronger than us," he said, his voice booming. "It's not because she's smarter or faster or tougher." He leaned closer to her, eyes narrowing with faux pity. "It's because the system needs a pretty face to put on posters. A token, a symbol of equality for the newspapers. That's what she is. A propaganda doll." The words hit the room like fuel tossed onto a fire. The men erupted with laughter again, louder this time, more vicious. They slapped each other on the back, elbowed one another, pointing at her uniform as though it had just turned into a costume. One man near the back shouted, "Maybe they gave her medals for smiling." Another added, "Or for crying on cue." The wave of ridicule spread like an infection, each voice emboldened by the approval of the others. Victor wasn't done. He circled her again, making a show of it, as if she were a fraud being exposed under a spotlight. His gold chain clinked against his chest as he gestured grandly to the crowd. "You know what happens when a man fails training?" he asked. "He's thrown out. End of story. But when a woman fails..." He paused dramatically, eyes locked on hers, savoring every second of the performance. "They change the rules. They lower the standards. They carry her across the finish line because it makes the politicians look good." The laughter shifted to nods of agreement, murmurs of approval. The lie had become believable, not because it was true, but because Victor spoke it with the authority of someone who had never been challenged. His men looked at him like disciples receiving scripture, their sneers sharpened by his confidence. She remained still, but the sting was undeniable. Not the sting of truth, because his words were lies, but the sting of watching those lies take root, watching men who didn't know her believe in his fabrication. That was the real cruelty, not just his voice, but the validation of dozens of others who now laughed as if her career, her sacrifice, her blood and scars were all a cheap trick. Victor leaned back, pretending to address her directly now, his voice dripping with disdain. "Tell me, Captain, what's the hardest thing you've done? File paperwork? Pose for a magazine? Or maybe cry in front of a general until he gave you those stripes?" The room exploded again, some doubling over, others whistling mock applause. The echoes bounced off the concrete walls, magnifying the humiliation, until it felt as though the building itself mocked her. It wasn't just noise. It was social proof. In that moment, perception mattered more than reality. To them, his story was the truth. They had seen her uniform, but now Victor had given them a new lens, one that painted her as a fraud, a weakling elevated by pity and politics, and they embraced it because mocking her made them feel stronger. One man leaned forward and muttered, loud enough for others to hear, I bet she never even fired her weapon in combat. Another replied, Bet she's never seen blood, except her own tears. Their words became a chorus, each lie stacked on the last, each exaggeration inflating the myth that she was nothing but a manufactured soldier. Victor spread his arms wide, as if delivering a final sermon. Gentlemen, don't be fooled by medals and uniforms. The government needs its heroes, but the streets, our streets, need warriors. And what stands here is no warrior. What stands here is a showpiece, a puppet. The applause, the whistles, the cruel chants. It was a tidal wave of falsehood, legitimized not by fact but by numbers. His men didn't need evidence. They had his charisma, his dominance, his confidence. That was enough. And yet while they laughed, she stayed motionless, her silence more deliberate with every passing second. Inside she wasn't breaking, she was cataloging. Every lie, every insult, every roar of laughter was being stored, like ammunition in a chamber. The more he exaggerated, the more he exposed his arrogance. Victor believed his own performance. He believed the room's reaction had sealed her fate, reducing her to nothing more than an ornament in a uniform. He didn't realize he was writing the script of his own downfall, because when the truth finally revealed itself, not in words but in action, it would not just silence his lie. It would make every man in that warehouse choke on their laughter, and she would not have to say a single word to do it. The chants still echoed in the air, bouncing off the warehouse walls like cruel music. Doll, puppet, showpiece. Each word was meant to strip her, to reduce her to nothing more than a costume filled with air. For a heartbeat, the weight of it pressed down on her chest, threatening to suffocate. She stood in the middle of that circle of laughter, and for the briefest flicker of a second, she felt the sting, not of shame but of memory. The echo of every time someone had doubted her. The instructors who told her she wouldn't last a week. The comrades who laughed behind her back when she showed up at training camp. The faces of men who muttered, "She'll quit by morning," while she laced her boots tighter and pushed forward. But unlike them, Victor's words did not pierce. They sharpened, because this wasn't the first time she had been called weak. It wasn't the first time someone tried to turn her identity into a weapon against her. But what always followed was the same. The silence of doubters replaced by the silence of defeat. Their defeat. Her fall, if it could even be called that, was not the collapse they expected. She didn't break. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. Instead, the fire inside her cooled into something infinitely more dangerous. Ice. The rage that rose within her wasn't the kind that burned out of control. It was the kind that solidified into clarity. Precision, inevitability. She felt her heartbeat slow, each thud like the tick of a clock counting down to something final. The noise around her faded, dulled as if submerged underwater. She could see mouths moving, hear bursts of laughter, but none of it reached her anymore. It was all background static. Her focus narrowed until there was only one figure left in the room who mattered. Victor. Her eyes locked on him. Cold, steady, unblinking. The weight of her silence settled over him even as he laughed, though he didn't feel it yet. But he would. Inside her head, something shifted. A door slammed shut. The part of her that endured quietly, the part that tolerated humiliation in the name of patience, died in that moment. What rose in its place was not desperation, but decision, a doll in uniform. The phrase repeated in her mind, but instead of stinging, it crystallized. She let it echo, turning it over like a blade in her hand. Words that were meant to humiliate her had become a trigger, a signal, the exact switch she needed to stop playing by the rules of restraint. It was almost laughable. He thought he had broken her. He thought he had exposed her. What he had done was sign his own sentence, because she was not fighting for dignity anymore. She was fighting for truth. And truth did not need an audience to roar. Truth needed only action. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the acrid air of smoke and rust. On the exhale, she felt the heaviness slide off her shoulders, replaced by the razor-edged calm she only felt in battle. It was the same calm that had steadied her hand when bullets tore the air around her in the desert. The same calm that had allowed her to guide men through minefields while explosions shook the ground. The same calm that separated survivors from casualties. She could almost hear her own voice whisper in her mind, "I am done waiting. I am done proving. I am done asking for respect. A single phrase crystallized, clear as glass. Tomorrow I will not wake the same. But the truth was, she didn't even have to wait until tomorrow. The transformation had already happened. The moment Victor's lie reached its crescendo, the moment the men's laughter hit its peak, something in her gaze shifted. It was as if her very presence had changed weight. She was no longer the quiet woman absorbing insults. She was the storm preparing to descend. She had fallen in their eyes. She had been reduced to nothing, mocked into invisibility. But in that abyss she had found something indestructible. Rage that no longer screamed but calculated. Rage that no longer burned but froze into resolve. Rage that did not blind but illuminated. She let her lips curl into the faintest smile, one so slight that only Victor, standing closest, could see it. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the smile of someone who had already made a decision. A smile that said, "This ends differently than you think." Victor didn't notice. He was still basking in the laughter of his men, still reveling in the theater of humiliation. But when the time came, and it would come sooner than any of them expected, he would realize what that smile meant. She had been humiliated, yes. But humiliation is only fatal to those who cling to ego. For her it was oxygen. For her it was the last spark needed to ignite a transformation. The fall was complete, and out of it rose not desperation but a sharpened will, not a wounded soldier but a predator poised to strike. And as she stood there, breathing calmly in the eye of their storm, she felt the weight of the decision settle into her bones. I will not answer with words. I will not answer with excuses. I will answer in the only language men like him understand. Decisive action. The laughter still thundered around her, but inside, everything had gone quiet. Not silence born of fear, but the silence of calculation. It was the same silence she had known on every battlefield. The moment when chaos slowed down and the brain became sharper than any blade. She scanned the room, not with the eyes of a humiliated victim, but with the cold precision of a captain who had survived ambushes, sieges, and firefights where the wrong choice meant death. Step 1. Map the field. The warehouse was long, rectangular, with crates stacked against the walls and steel beams crossing the ceiling. A single exit door stood to her right, guarded by 2 men, both armed with pistols holstered carelessly at their sides. One leaned against the wall, the other fidgeted with a lighter. Neither was ready. Ahead, Victor stood at the center, his chest puffed, his arrogance exposed like an unarmored ribcage. He carried a knife on his belt, a showpiece more for intimidation than utility. His real weapon was dominance, the way he wielded the crowd's laughter like a whip. But dominance wasn't steel. It wasn't gunpowder. It couldn't block a strike. Around him, 12 men formed a loose circle. She counted them without blinking, memorizing their stances, their weapons, their carelessness. 4 had guns, 2 pistols tucked into waistbands, 1 revolver clutched lazily in a hand, and 1 submachine gun resting dangerously low at the hip of a man too busy laughing to realize his grip was weak. The rest carried knives, pipes, or nothing at all. Overconfidence was their true weapon, and overconfidence was the easiest to dismantle. Step 2. Measure the space, 6 feet between her and Victor. 10 feet to the man with the revolver, 15 feet to the submachine gun. Distance meant seconds, and seconds meant life. At her fastest, she could cover 6 feet in less than 1 second. 10 feet in under 2. 15 feet, 2.5, maybe 3, depending on obstacles. Every second mattered. Every second could be the difference between victory and bleeding out on the cold concrete floor. Step 3. Calculate the order. If she moved first against Victor, the men with guns would have time to react. She needed to neutralize the most immediate threats first. The revolver was sloppily held. The man distracted, laughing so hard his shoulders shook. He would go down first. A disarm, a strike, 1 second. Next, the submachine gun. Heavy, powerful, but cumbersome. The man wielding it had no discipline. His stance wide, his eyes darting, his grip loose. She could disable him in 2 seconds if she got close. That meant a roll forward, a strike to the wrist, a knee to the gut, and control of the weapon before the others realized what had happened. From there, the pistols. The 2 at the door were too far for immediate danger. Their mistake. The 2 closer to Victor wore them tucked inside their waistbands with no retention straps. They would fumble if they tried to draw quickly. She gave them 3 seconds at most, 3 seconds where her speed would already have decided their fate. Step 4. Consider obstacles. The crates along the walls were cover if she needed it. The steel beams above, irrelevant. The bottles and glasses scattered across tables were distractions waiting to be used. And the crowd itself, Victor's men, were clustered too tightly. If chaos broke out, they would get in each other's way. Their numbers were their illusion of power, but their lack of discipline turned them into liabilities. Step 5. Timeline. She mapped it in her head the way she once mapped supply lines in the desert. Not with money, but with seconds. First second, disarm the revolver. Second and third seconds, disable the submachine gun. Secure control. Fourth second, strike one pistol holder before he can draw. Fifth second, pivot to the second pistol. Sixth second, Victor. 6 seconds. That was her entire plan. 6 seconds to dismantle an empire built on arrogance. 6 seconds to turn their laughter into silence. Her mind ticked through it again and again, faster each time, stripping away uncertainty until it became muscle memory before the first movement even began. The gangster thought the crowd made him untouchable. But she had seen bigger crowds crumble. She had watched armies scatter when their leaders fell. She knew that when fear entered a group, it spread like fire through dry grass. All she had to do was spark it. Her eyes swept the room one final time. Each man catalogued, each weapon accounted for, each distance measured. The numbers lined up in her head like a spreadsheet. Not dollars spent, but seconds saved. Not losses tallied, but weaknesses exposed. To the men around her, she was still the silent doll in a uniform. To her, they were already variables in an equation that ended with their defeat. And Victor was the final line of that equation. He was not the problem. He was the sum, and in 6 calculated seconds she would prove it. She exhaled slowly, steadying her body, her mind sharpened to a single point. The decision had been made. The accounting was finished. The math was clear. And for the first time in that smoky warehouse, the battlefield belonged to her. The calculations were finished. The plan was clear. 6 seconds to dismantle everything Victor thought he controlled. But before her body moved, her voice did. It wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. Step back. Now. 2 words, clipped, precise, cold. The sound cut through the room sharper than a gunshot. For the first time since she had walked into the warehouse, the laughter faltered. It didn't matter that she hadn't shouted. It was the tone. The kind of tone that didn't beg, didn't plead, didn't even argue. It commanded. It was the voice of someone who had ordered men into battles they weren't sure they'd survive, and brought them back alive. Heads turned. The men froze mid-laugh, mouths still open, shoulders half shaking as if their bodies hadn't yet caught up to the sudden silence. Even Victor's smirk twitched, faltering for the briefest instant before he masked it again with bravado. But that instant was enough. The shift had happened. Her eyes stayed locked on his, unblinking. Her shoulders squared, her boots planted firm against the concrete floor. She didn't flinch under their stares. She didn't lower her head. She didn't let the weight of their numbers press her down. She stood as if the entire room belonged to her, as if the men around her were nothing more than shadows passing across her battlefield. The silence grew heavier with every second she refused to look away. The air thickened. A few of Victor's men glanced at each other, uncertain. They had seen defiance before. Drunken outbursts, desperate pleas, but this was different. There was no desperation in her tone, no tremor in her body. Only control, Victor chuckled, trying to claw back the room. You hear that? He said, looking around, forcing a laugh. The doll thinks she's giving orders now, but his voice didn't carry the same dominance as before. It wavered at the edges, a faint crack smothered under false amusement. His men laughed again, but softer this time, hesitant. The sound no longer rolled like thunder. It stumbled uneven, like an engine losing power. Her silence pressed against them harder than his words did. Step back, she repeated, each syllable measured, steady. The authority in her tone wasn't performance. It wasn't theater. It was born of years in command, of barking orders under fire, of making decisions when hesitation meant coffins. And the human ear recognized it instinctively. These men weren't soldiers, but even they felt the primal truth in her voice. This was not someone bluffing. This was someone who meant exactly what she said. One of the younger gangsters shifted his weight uncomfortably. His laugh died in his throat. Another man's hand twitched toward his pistol, then hesitated when her eyes flicked to him. Just a flick of her gaze, no words, and his fingers froze like they had been caught in a trap. Victor tried again, louder this time, forcing bravado into his chest. "Or what?" he barked. "What will you do, Captain? You think you can order us around like your little toy soldiers? You think this is your parade ground?" She didn't answer. That was the brilliance of it. No explanation, no justification, no wasted words. The order stood on its own. Step back now, the silence stretched. Every second that passed without her breaking became a weapon. The tension wrapped around the men like chains, squeezing, suffocating. The warehouse, once filled with laughter, now felt like a courtroom where every eye was waiting for judgment, and judgment was written in her stillness. For the first time, they weren't laughing at her. They were watching her, measuring her, wondering if they had miscalculated. The shift was subtle but undeniable. The power had tilted. Victor could feel it. He felt the control slipping through his fingers like sand, and it infuriated him. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared. He stepped forward, closing the distance, trying to reclaim the dominance he had just lost. But when his boots echoed against the floor, the sound didn't land like authority. It landed like defiance, his defiance against her command, and everyone in the room recognized it, because the dynamic had flipped. It was no longer her silence against his noise. It was his noise against her silence, and silence was winning. The younger gangster who had faltered earlier took half a step back, almost imperceptibly. Another lowered his hand from the pistol grip at his belt. Small cracks, but cracks all the same. Cracks Victor could see, cracks that made his blood boil. Her stillness was contagious. Her command, though simple, had rooted itself in their minds. They were no longer sure if she was the victim or the executioner. They no longer knew if they were the predators or the prey, and that uncertainty, that hesitation, was all she needed. It was the first inversion, the first real turn. In that instant, the doll in a uniform was gone. What stood before them now was a captain of the special forces, radiating command without raising her voice, without lifting a hand. The balance of power had shifted, and though they didn't yet understand it, they had already begun to obey. Victor could no longer tolerate the silence. The laughter that once crowned him king of the room had evaporated, replaced by something heavier. Uncertainty, hesitation, cracks in the loyalty of his men. Every second she stood there, unflinching, widened those cracks, so he did the only thing he knew. He stepped forward, chest puffed, chin raised, radiating the false bravado of a predator whose power had been challenged. His boots struck the concrete like war drums. He wanted each step to echo dominance, to remind everyone of who he was. "Enough," he growled, his voice low but venomous. "You don't command me. You don't command anything here," the crowd murmured, leaning forward, caught between spectacle and unease. Some smirked, desperate to believe their leader would reassert control. Others swallowed hard, sensing the tide shifting in ways they couldn't name. Victor closed the gap until he stood inches from her. His height, his bulk, his tattoos etched into skin like warnings. Every detail screamed intimidation. He leaned down, his face only breaths from hers. His hand twitched, ready to shove her, to break the invisible line she had drawn with nothing but words. That was his mistake. The instant his shoulders shifted forward, she moved. Her body was a blur, faster than their eyes could follow. One hand clamped his wrist, twisting it with surgical precision, redirecting his momentum against him. His body bent forward with a grunt, his attempt at dominance collapsing in on itself. Before he could recover, her knee drove upward into his chest, forcing the air from his lungs in a violent gasp. The room erupted in chaos, but she was already moving. The first lieutenant, the one nearest the table, reached for his pistol. Her boot snapped upward, kicking the weapon clean out of his hand before it cleared the holster. It clattered across the concrete, useless. Her follow-through spun her body, and her elbow cracked into his jaw. He hit the ground like a sack of bricks, groaning as his blood stained the floor. Another charged her from behind, a steel pipe raised. She didn't turn her head. She didn't need to. She dropped low, sweeping her leg in a wide arc that smashed into his ankles. The man toppled backward, the pipe flying from his hand. She rose in the same fluid motion, her fist crashing into his throat before he could even scream. He collapsed, choking, clawing at the air. Seconds. Only seconds had passed. The others hesitated. Their bravado evaporated. They had mocked her as a doll, but dolls don't dismantle men like machines. Dolls don't break bones in silence. Victor roared, clutching his ribs, trying to push himself upright. Fury twisted his features, more animal than man. He lunged again, fist swinging wide, desperate to reassert himself. She sidestepped with clinical ease, her hand snapping upward to trap his elbow. A twist, a pivot, and the crack of ligaments tearing echoed through the warehouse. His scream followed, high and raw, the sound of a man whose myth had just shattered. She shoved him backward and he fell, flat on his back, staring up at her. His gold watch gleamed under the flickering light, but all his wealth, all his power, meant nothing now. The silence that followed was louder than any gunshot. The men stared, their weapons half drawn, frozen in disbelief. Their leader, the untouchable Victor, the king of shadows, was on the ground. Humiliated, wheezing, his arm useless. His pride obliterated, and she hadn't even broken a sweat. Her posture was calm, her breathing steady. She didn't gloat. She didn't roar in triumph. She simply stood over him, the embodiment of authority. The woman they had laughed at, the doll in a uniform, had dismantled their entire hierarchy in less than 10 seconds. The visual was undeniable. Victor on the floor, gasping. His men sprawled around him, groaning, disarmed, defeated. And her, straight-backed, uniform unwrinkled, gaze cold as steel. The balance of power wasn't just tilted now. It had been obliterated. Humiliation was complete. He had tried to intimidate her with size, with noise, with violence, and in seconds she had exposed him for what he truly was. Not a king, not a predator, but just another man who underestimated the wrong opponent. The crowd's silence was its own judgment. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't chanting. They weren't even breathing too loudly. Every eye was fixed on her, and every mind knew the truth. The moment of ridicule had transformed into a memory of fear they would never erase. And Victor, groaning, clutching his ruined arm, staring up at her in disbelief, was forced to see himself the way they now saw him. Broken, powerless, humiliated before the very men who once worshipped him. For a long second, the warehouse was frozen in stillness. The sound of Victor hitting the ground still echoed faintly, as though the walls themselves hadn't yet absorbed it. A few men groaned where they lay sprawled, clutching broken jaws, bruised throats or wrists twisted beyond use. The rest stood motionless, caught between the instinct to run and the terror of moving at all. Silence. Heavy, undeniable, absolute. Then slowly, other sounds emerged. The scrape of a chair being pushed back, the cautious shuffle of boots. Not from Victor's gang, but from the edges of the room, where the observers had stood. Not everyone inside was a gangster. A handful of civilians had been there, dragged in as witnesses to Victor's spectacle. A bar owner who paid protection money, a shopkeeper who had been forced to deliver supplies, a mechanic whose garage Victor used as a front, and near the far wall, 2 men in plain clothes who had been too disciplined, too quiet, too watchful to be criminals. Soldiers, her soldiers. They had come quietly, assigned to observe, to gauge what kind of storm Victor was stirring. They hadn't expected to see their captain humiliated, surrounded, mocked, and yet they had held position, waiting, watching, trusting, because they knew her. Now they stepped forward. Their eyes met hers, and in that instant the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of recognition. Soldiers recognize precision. They recognize when movement is not luck but training, when speed is not panic but mastery. They had seen it in the way she disarmed, the way she broke the circle of men without hesitation, the way every strike landed exactly where it needed to. One of them, a tall corporal with sharp features, snapped to attention instinctively. He didn't say a word, but the gesture was enough. Respect radiated from the posture itself. A salute wasn't necessary. The straightness of his back, the steadiness of his gaze carried all the acknowledgement she needed. The civilians followed in their own way. The bar owner, who had watched, wringing his hands, now stared at her as though he was seeing her for the first time. The mechanic, whose knuckles were scarred from years of forced labor for Victor's crew, nodded slowly, his lips parting as if to say something, but failing to form the words. Even the shopkeeper, trembling moments earlier, found his shoulders straighten. The fear in his eyes didn't vanish, but it was replaced with something different. Hope. This was the true inversion. At the beginning, when Victor mocked her, the crowd had been complicit. They had laughed, they had nodded, they had validated his lies. Social proof had amplified humiliation. But now, after witnessing her skill with their own eyes, after seeing Victor's myth collapse under her strikes, the social proof had reversed. The same mechanism that once tore her down was now raising her higher than any speech could have. Respect doesn't always roar. Sometimes it breathes quietly, reshaping the air in a room. That's what she felt now. Every gaze anchored to her, not with mockery but with weight. Not the weight of fear alone, but of recognition. They had seen what she truly was. Not a symbol, not a token, not a doll. A soldier. A captain. A leader. Victor tried to rise, clutching his arm, his face twisted in pain. But when he looked around, he saw it too. His men didn't look at him the way they once had. Their eyes flicked back and forth, uncertain, avoiding his gaze. Loyalty built on fear was crumbling, dissolving in the face of what they had just witnessed. They had seen him fall, and worse, they had seen her rise. He opened his mouth to bark another order, but no sound came. His words would have bounced uselessly against the wall of silence that now belonged to her. Because authority, real authority, doesn't need to be shouted. It simply exists. The corporal near the wall finally spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried across the room like steel sliding from a sheath. Captain. That single word was acknowledgement, not of her uniform, not of her rank stitched onto fabric, but of what she had just proven in front of them all. Her chin lifted slightly, but she didn't smile. Respect wasn't something to gloat over. Respect was a current, invisible but undeniable, and once it shifted, it carried everything with it. The civilians began to murmur, not mocking this time, but reverent, uncertain, even grateful. She saved herself. She faced them alone. She stood where no one else would. Their whispers spread, and with them, the weight of the narrative shifted permanently. She had been mocked in front of everyone. Now she was validated in front of everyone. It was a different kind of victory than the strikes and takedowns. Physical dominance was undeniable, but this was deeper. The proof of ability realigned perception. The witnesses themselves became her defense, her echo, her amplification. Where Victor's lie once stood tall, their silence and murmurs tore it down. At the beginning, laughter had been her prison. Now silence was her crown. The silence in the warehouse had turned into a weight pressing down on every chest. Victor lay on the concrete, wheezing, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle, his gold watch smeared with dust and blood. Around him, his men hesitated, their loyalty fractured, their eyes darting anywhere but his face. But humiliation is a fire. And in men like Victor, it doesn't die quietly. It flares in ugly bursts, desperate to consume anything that will restore its warmth. He shoved himself up, stumbling to his knees, his breath ragged. His voice cracked at first, then rose with false strength. "You think this proves anything?" he spat, coughing between words. You caught me off guard. That's all. A cheap trick. If I had been ready, if I wasn't blindsided, you'd already be dead." The words spilled fast, desperate, like a gambler trying to convince the table he hadn't really lost. He clutched his chest, forcing his body upright, forcing his men to look at him. He needed them to believe. He needed himself to believe. "This doesn't mean you're stronger," he barked, his teeth bared. "It means you're sneaky. It means you can't face me when I'm prepared. That's what it means." A hollow murmur of agreement rippled through the gang, weak and unconvincing. Some nodded out of habit, not conviction. Others looked away, their silence louder than any affirmation. Even they knew the difference between a leader standing tall and a man choking on excuses. She didn't move. Her boots remained planted, her hands relaxed at her sides. But her eyes never left him. Calm, icy. She let him rant, let his words echo into the space, let him paint himself into a corner. And then she spoke. Her voice was even, almost quiet, but it carried across the room like a blade sliding free of its sheath. On the street, "You command?" she said, her gaze locking him in place. "Here on your turf, surrounded by your men, you roar and they obey." She took one step forward. He flinched. The room noticed, but on the battlefield, her pause was deliberate, the silence between words forcing everyone to lean closer. "You fall in seconds." The words landed heavier than any punch. They weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried the authority of someone who had seen men crumble in real war zones, who had buried comrades who had survived when others didn't. In the alleys. "You're a king," she continued, her tone sharper now, slicing through the room. "But kings without armies are just men in costumes. Out there, in fire, in chaos, in blood. You wouldn't last a minute." Victor's face twisted. Fury, shame, panic. He tried to stand taller, to sneer, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed him. His body remembered what his ego denied, how quickly she had dropped him, how mercilessly she had dismantled his men. Her words weren't just aimed at him. They were aimed at everyone watching. The civilians, the gangsters, the soldiers in plain clothes. Each syllable rewrote the narrative. His empire, built on intimidation, was revealed for what it was: a kingdom of smoke. A fragile illusion. "Street rules don't win wars," she added, her voice steady as a gun barrel. "You measure power in whispers and shadows. I measure it in seconds and survival." Victor staggered, searching for something to say, something to claw back respect. But every attempt died in his throat. His own men weren't looking at him anymore. Their eyes were on her. The bar owner, who had once shrunk in fear whenever Victor entered his tavern, now stared openly. The mechanic who had fixed Victor's cars without pay let out a sharp exhale, almost a laugh of disbelief. Even the younger gangsters, those who had chanted "doll" earlier, shifted uncomfortably, realizing how small their idol looked under her gaze, and Victor knew it. He saw the shift, he felt it. His words had bought him nothing. His excuses had betrayed him. The man who once ruled with myth was now naked under the light of truth. Her words had done what her fists alone could not. They had stripped him of the illusion of invincibility. He bared his teeth, but it wasn't a smile. It was desperation masquerading as defiance. His pride had been cut deeper than any bone, but she didn't gloat. She didn't step closer. She didn't need to. The verdict had already been delivered, not by her, but by the silence of the room. Victor had tried to escalate. He had tried to rewrite the humiliation. But his counterattack had crumbled the same way he had. Fast, graceless, undeniable. And her final words still hung in the air like a sentence carved into stone. "On the street, you command. On the battlefield, you fall in seconds." The warehouse had turned into a courtroom without walls, without robes, without gavels. No judge had been called, no jury sworn in, but the air was thick with judgment all the same. Every man, every civilian, every soldier in plain clothes, they were no longer spectators. They were jurors, and Victor, the self-proclaimed king of shadows, was on trial. He had no defense. His attempt at excuses had collapsed under her words. His body was bruised, his arm useless, his pride gutted. He had tried to stand tall, to roar, to reclaim authority. But every sound he made only reminded the room of his weakness. Every stagger of his boots, every twitch of his jaw, was evidence against him. She, on the other hand, didn't argue her case. She didn't need to. Her performance was the testimony. The speed of her counters, the precision of her strikes, the way she dismantled weapons and men in seconds. Those actions were irrefutable. They stood taller than any speech. They resonated louder than any proclamation of rank. Authority had shifted from title to proof. At first, the crowd had validated Victor's mockery. They had laughed with him, nodded at his words, become accomplices in her humiliation. That was the first trial, and she had been the one condemned. But the verdict hadn't held. With every movement she made, she appealed, not to them directly, but to their instincts, to the primal recognition of strength and control. Now the appeal had succeeded, and the verdict had reversed. The civilians whispered, their voices carrying in the silence. She broke him. He didn't stand a chance. That's real power. Their murmurs stacked one on top of another, a chorus of recognition. They weren't speaking to her directly. They were speaking to each other, to themselves, to history. And history was already writing its judgment. The soldiers stepped forward, no longer silent observers. They didn't need to shout or applaud. Their presence alone was validation. Their posture, the subtle straightness of men acknowledging a superior, was worth more than applause. It was acknowledgement of truth. Victor looked around, his eyes darting, searching desperately for loyalty, for one of his men to step forward, to lift him up, to defend his honor. But none did. Their silence was louder than betrayal. It was the silence of men who had just watched their idol collapse under the weight of reality. That silence was the gavel. He tried once more, his voice hoarse. "This isn't over." But he stopped, because as he spoke, the crowd didn't turn toward him. Their eyes remained fixed on her. No one flinched at his words. No one validated his noise. His voice hung in the air like smoke that dissipated without effect. She hadn't needed to silence him. They had done it for her. That was the tribunal. Not legal, but social. A collective recognition that one truth had been proven and another destroyed. And once a truth is witnessed by many, it cannot be undone. She stood in the center of it, not basking in glory, but unshaken, composed, almost detached. Her stillness wasn't arrogance. It was control. She didn't need to demand their respect. She had earned it. The tribunal had delivered its sentence. She was the authority. She was the reality. And Victor, his myth shattered, his pride dissolved, was nothing more than a man exposed. The bar owner whispered to the mechanic, his voice trembling but resolute. "She's the one we should have feared." "Not him," the mechanic nodded, adding softly, "She's the one who should lead." Those words, quiet as they were chains tightening around Victor's throat. Because once respect shifts, never shifts back. This wasn't about uniforms anymore. It wasn't about titles or medals or hierarchy. It was about demonstration, proof, performance under pressure. She had shown them all, and they had believed. For Victor, there was no appeal left. No excuses, no lies, no bravado that could rewrite what everyone had seen. He had been dismantled not just by her hands, but by their eyes. And that is the cruelest kind of defeat. Not just to lose, but to lose publicly. To lose in front of every witness whose memory will carry the humiliation further than any rumor could. To lose in such a way that even silence damns you. The tribunal had spoken, and its verdict was irreversible. She was no longer the target of laughter. She was the embodiment of respect. And Victor was no longer a king of shadows. He was a story, a cautionary tale, a man who mocked the wrong woman and was destroyed in front of everyone who once believed in him. The gavel of silence fell one final time, and the sentence was clear. She had won. He had been judged, and there was nothing left for him but the weight of humiliation, carried not by her words, but by the memory of every single witness in the room. The warehouse no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a tomb for Victor's reputation. The echoes of violence still lingered in the air, the groans of his men, the metallic rattle of discarded weapons on concrete, the faint drip of blood from a split lip onto the floor. But the fight itself was over. She knew it, and more importantly, everyone else knew it too. Victor lay slumped against a crate, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. His good hand clutched at his broken arm, as if holding the pieces together could somehow restore what had been lost. But it wasn't the bones that had shattered most. It was his image, his myth, the aura of invincibility that had kept him enthroned in the shadows for years. Now, under the cold flicker of the warehouse lights, he was exposed, small, weak, mortal. She didn't approach him again. There was no need. The point had been made, carved into the silence, etched into every pair of eyes watching. Her boots shifted slightly, the faint scrape against concrete drawing attention back to her. She stood tall, uniform still neat, her breathing calm and controlled as though she hadn't just dismantled an empire in less than a minute. There was no adrenaline haze, no triumphal gloating, no hunger for more. She didn't need to prove herself further because the proof already filled the room like oxygen. Instead, she turned, slowly, deliberately. Her shoulders squared, her steps even. Each stride carried the weight of finality, not a retreat but an exit, the kind of departure only victors are allowed. The crowd parted without command. Gangsters, civilians, even her fellow soldiers, none dared block her path. They shifted instinctively, giving her space. Their silence now transformed from mockery into reverence. Heads lowered slightly as she passed, some out of respect, others out of fear, most out of the unshakable realization that they had just witnessed something irreversible. Behind her, Victor made a noise, half groan, half whimper. The kind of sound a man makes when he realizes no amount of shouting or threats will restore what's been lost. It was the sound of a dethroned ruler, not yet dead, but already erased. She didn't turn back. Looking at him again would have been mercy, and mercy was not what this moment demanded. Mercy, in fact, would have diluted the impact. True dominance isn't about finishing an enemy. It's about leaving them alive with their failure echoing louder than any death. Her steps carried her to the exit, the warehouse doors looming tall and heavy. Each second of her walk was an epilogue written not in words but in presence. She had entered as the subject of ridicule. She left as the definition of authority. Just before she reached the threshold, she paused, not for herself but for them, for the witnesses, the jurors, the future tellers of this story. Her voice, calm and sharp, cut through the silence one final time. "Respect isn't asked for," she said without raising her tone. "It's earned." The words rang out like the last strike of a bell. Simple, undeniable, final. Then she pushed the doors open. A flood of outside light spilled into the darkness of the warehouse, washing over her figure, turning her silhouette into something larger than life. For a heartbeat, the contrast blinded them, their world of smoke and shadows eclipsed by the daylight she carried with her. And then she was gone, her footsteps fading into the distance, leaving only silence and awe behind. The room remained frozen. No one dared speak immediately. The soldiers exchanged glances, their nods subtle but full of meaning. The civilians whispered, not with mockery this time, but with reverence. And Victor's men stood motionless, their loyalty fractured beyond repair, each one grappling with the truth they had just seen. Victor shifted again, groaning, trying to push himself upright. But the sight of him, alone, broken, desperate, only deepened the contrast. He was no longer the center. He was no longer the story. She was. And the story wasn't just that she had defeated him. It was that she had transformed the narrative entirely. She had taken the laughter, the jeers, the humiliation, and reshaped them into silence, respect, and fear. She had proven that authority isn't stitched onto a uniform or written into a title. It's demonstrated, embodied, undeniable. And the witnesses would carry that memory. They would repeat it, whisper it in bars and garages and markets. The tale would spread. How the gangster who ruled the streets was humiliated in seconds by the youngest captain of the special forces. How respect had shifted permanently, irreversibly. Victor's myth had died that day. Hers had been born. And the final words she had left behind would echo long after the doors had closed, a mantra etched into the minds of everyone present. Respect isn't asked for. It's earned. The echo of her final words. Respect isn't asked for. It's earned. Still lingers in the air like smoke. The warehouse fades. The broken figure of Victor becomes a shadow in memory. And what remains is not just her victory, but a question that refuses to leave. Because behind the spectacle, behind the silence that transformed into respect, lies a truth that reaches beyond uniforms, beyond titles, beyond the walls of any battlefield. It's the truth about confrontation, about power, about what happens when arrogance collides with discipline. Now I want you to step into that silence for a moment. Forget the uniform. Forget the warehouse. Forget Victor and his empire of shadows. Picture yourself instead, standing face to face with someone trained not just to fight, but to win wars. Someone whose life has been sculpted by years of grueling discipline, whose reflexes are sharpened into blades, whose mind can turn chaos into strategy in a fraction of a second. And now ask yourself, honestly, would you have the courage to stand there? To keep your chin raised while their gaze cuts through you like steel? To feel the weight of a presence forged in battle, knowing that a single wrong move could end it all in seconds? It's not about whether you'd win. Deep down, you already know the answer. It's about whether you would even try. Because courage, like respect, isn't something you're handed. It isn't something you can fake in front of a crowd. Courage is revealed only in the moment of truth, when laughter turns to silence, when words fail, when all that matters is what you can prove. So let me turn this story back to you. Would you dare face someone trained to dismantle an opponent before they could even draw a breath? Would you hold your ground when their silence becomes heavier than any insult? Would you survive not the fists or the weapons, but the sheer psychological dominance of a soldier who has stared down death and walked away? These aren't questions to answer lightly. They are questions meant to linger, to haunt, to make you examine not just the fight in this story, but the fights in your own life. Because every one of us meets a victor at some point. The arrogant boss, the manipulative rival, the person who thinks power is noise instead of proof. And when that moment comes, the question isn't whether you can humiliate them. The question is whether you can stand like she did. Calm, steady, unflinching, until the silence itself bends in your direction. Now, if this story made you pause, if it made you picture yourself in that warehouse, if it made you wonder whether you'd be laughing with the crowd or standing frozen in awe, then this channel is where you belong. Because here, every story is more than entertainment. It's a battlefield of ideas, a test of what we believe about power, respect, and the human spirit. If you felt the weight of that silence, if you want to carry the kind of strength that doesn't ask for validation but earns it, then don't let this moment end here. Share your thoughts below. Tell me, would you face someone like her? Or would you crumble like Victor? Add your voice to this tribunal, not of gangsters and soldiers, but of minds reflecting on what true power looks like. And if you want more stories like this, tales that test pride, strip away illusions and reveal truths about respect, dominance, and survival, then subscribe, because the next story will challenge you just as much as this one. Remember, every video here is more than a tale. It's a mirror. Sometimes it shows you Victor. Sometimes it shows you her, and sometimes shows you yourself. So I'll leave you with this question one final time. Would you have the courage to face someone trained to end a fight in seconds? Think carefully, comment your answer, and subscribe if you're ready to step into more stories that don't just entertain, but confront.